Everything will change. Welcome, everyone. And if you don't know what that was actually from my presentation at Data Innovation Summit. And people have been mocking me ever since. So I thought I'd make a thing of it. I have the great opportunity to talk about where I think we're going in the industry, machine learning or data science. I call the presentation today Our Next Move, and somebody that saw this commented and said, it sounds like you're a general trying to point the way on where we're going. First we take Europe and then we take the world. But I made a few observations that the last few years, and I started as a data scientist pretty much when the title was invented, but I worked with data prior to that. I worked a lot on the models. I worked a lot in organizations. But the conversation the last few years has changed. I remember in 2014 and 2015 when I constantly failed, when those of you that were in the field most likely failed as well. And I remember the conversations on the hundreds of millions SEK or dollars that were poured into Hadoop clusters and infrastructure, and nothing ever worked. It still doesn't work. I like to change the conversation away from modeling, away from algorithm, not because it's not fun, because it is super fun, you all know it, but change the language so people can understand what we're speaking about. Now, what do I mean with that? So take software engineering. There might be a few engineers in the field here. The field was invented somewhere in the 60s, or even earlier, depends on who you talk to. But the path of software engineering has progressed and become quite mature these days. I had a conversation in London about 2017 or 2018. And the guy I was talking to was a software engineer. And he said, your field is going to go through exactly the same path as software engineering. So you could just look at what we have done right now and adopt it. And I used to talk about models before that. And that changed the entire conversation for me. So what I started talking about in 2017, on Data Innovation Summit even, was analytics ops, as we called it. And then somebody took it and called it ML ops. But the thing is that we try to integrate the modeling with the technology to actually have a clear path to production. I think that we now need to mature the conversation even more and start talking about capabilities. And if you don't know what I mean when I talk about capabilities, don't worry, because I'll give you an explanation. But take an outside-in perspective. So in large enterprises, there's the field of enterprise architecture. Don't all of you run out the door immediately, because I'm not a big fan of the enterprise architecture field fully. But there are some good things in there. And one thing they talk about, what capabilities do organization needs? The problem, however, is that they are on too high level. So we need to adopt the conversation to our field. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, if this is you, it's definitely been me. It is very hard to explain to an organization the execution path of our notebooks. And now all of you are sitting there thinking, I understand it. But that's not the thing, right? Because what we want to build are maintainable models. We want to make sure people understand what we're doing. We want to have repeatable patterns and produce a lot of value. So that's not me anymore, mainly because I don't write that code on a daily basis, and I don't like Jupyter Notebooks that much either. I'm an IDE guy, but that's another topic. But the other thing we're trying to address with this conversation is scale. If you're doing one model, I'm not going to tell you to talk about capabilities. If you're doing two models, neither. If you're producing value and the business is saying, we want to do 100 models, then I'm going to tell you that you need to start maturing the field. Because what we see today are enormous amount of resource constraints, waste duplication, technical debt, slow rollout time. There are no best practices. Well, some there might be. This is problematic when we're reaching critical mass. It is not problematic when we start. because when we start, it's more important to show that it's working and we can produce value. But when we are maturing, we need to change the entire conversation. Now, why would you want to do that? I gave you one good reason, but there are some research actually showcasing that if you've done this for a while and if you are maturing, you will be faster, more scalable. And basically what this chart says that if you've done it for several years, it goes faster. And the key of doing that is maturing your technology stack, your modeling practices, your integration, defining the capabilities. So, what is a capability? Any takers? A fluffy word used by enterprise architects and people that don't know what they're talking about? Well, a capability, it is something the company does. So, what a capability is not, is basically when we talk about a model, that's not a capability. When we talk about a specific use case, I want to do a churn use case, that's not a capability either. It starts with the definition of ability to. And I had these conversations with a couple of companies, and usually you get, but I want to do X use case. Well, good. What do you need in order to be able to do so? What are the repeatable patterns and what is hindering you of doing that? That is the conversation we need to take at some point. I know a lot of you are data scientists, machine learning engineers, and it's easy to get stuck into technology. It is easy to get stuck into good modeling practices, and it's easy to have a conversation with your peers about how you should tune certain things. That is valuable for you in that moment when you're working on that problem. But on a larger context, it can be quite problematic. Because when you only talk about the specifics with the organization, you ask them, what use case do you want to do? You're not addressing the entirety of the problem. So when should you do it? There is a breaking point on when you should start doing these things. It's when your capacity is restrained or producing more things, and the pull from the business side is larger when you can handle it. And you shouldn't do it before. Crystal clear, right, what a capability is in this context. So, it's something the company does. Not something it has, such as a resource or an asset. You are not capabilities. Your models are not capabilities. It is what you do. So how do you start with these things? Well, if you're now at a company and you're starting to scale up, and you might find yourself in this situation, if you're not in this situation, if you're good on what you're doing, and you're producing a lot of value, you're going to get to this situation. And if your manager says it's time to scale up, this is the perfect time to have this conversation. When you start having this conversation, and why I'm not standing on the stage talking about MLOps today, because I think in 2019, I did the introduction on how to build a machine learning system. Might have been interesting for some of you as well. But why I want to have this conversation is because it's so much bigger. You want to identify the teams of what you're actually going to produce to the organization. Not what model, but what different teams do you want them to pick up on. MLOps might be such a team. I'm not giving you a 100% answer here because it varies from organization to organization. But usually what you can see are a lot of topics around data. A team around data publishing, making the data accessible to the organization. MLOps might be a team. DataOps might even be. Training might be. The thing here is there are a lot of hypotheses amongst you what the organization need. So when you get started with all of these topics, you need to do the groundwork first. You need to define a good enough level of your different capabilities. The ones you see behind me are actually real-life examples from some of the customers I've worked with that they have identified. They are not the ground truth, but they are a starting point. And I know many of you are, especially in this field, are very detailed-oriented. And when you see this, you might say, well, this is too high level. How can this ever produce value? Well, what it does is actually narrow in and scoping the problem statement. So this is just the first iteration. On the lower end, you can have technology topics, key enabling technology pieces that actually you need to have in place. And why I'm not putting in the vendor names in here, because they don't matter. They don't matter. It is what you can do with the technology that matters. I'm not going to mention any, but if you walk around, you might talk to a few vendors that can do everything, and I'm sure they can. But when I look at different companies, they have 4 or 5 systems providing the same capabilities. They have a data warehouse, they have a data lake, they have a compute engine. All of these topics doesn't matter if they don't work. So you need to define what capabilities that you need. And I can guarantee you, many of them are going to be data related. Many of the projects I've been running on this topic, somebody says we want to do an AI use case. 90% of what they actually want to do is be better at data. So you need to start defining the starting point in your organization on what it is that you want your data science department or your data department or CDO office to be able to produce to the organization. And you're most likely going to be almost right, but most definitely have many wrongs as well. Because the second step will actually be to ask them, and I know that's hard, but unless you actually start asking them what's important for them, you are going to prioritize the wrong way. And when I say prioritize the wrong way, it's going to be, if you're a data science department, most likely you are going to start on the modeling side. But this is also an example that I did once. I said, doing a use case, what type of capabilities do you need? Well, when you do a use case, how do you do a use case within data science? Well, if you have an academic background and you know how to do this well, you probably start with framing the problem statement. Hopefully none of you feel embarrassed now that you never framed the problem correctly. The second state would be to understand the data availability. The third would most likely be to source the data, right? Going to the fourth, storing it, ethical assessment, and then run a POC. So this is a generic capability process, not covering all aspects, of doing an AI use case. And then you turn around to them and say, okay, what doesn't work? And when you have a look at this, sourcing the data usually never works. Ethical assessment usually is non-existing. And now all of a sudden, you have identified the key pain points of scaling up, right? And that's what we're trying to do here. Remember, this was the breaking point, going from 10 models to 100 models to 1,000 models. This doesn't make sense before you start scaling. And then you can immediately identify, okay, we need to work on sourcing the data. And then some of you are going to say, yeah, we already knew that. The problem is usually when you are in an organization that you only look at it from one point of view. I'm not saying you need to fix the data sourcing explicitly, because when you do a deep dive, and this is a fancy presentation, but when you do a deep dive, you forget to look at all the aspects. Doing data sourcing, sometimes, usually, most organizations just look on the technology aspect. I've seen organizations have the greatest data lake, but then they have a backlog that covers 5 years of sourcing backlog. So they might be green in the technology space. That's good. And the engineers in the room say, yeah, we've done our work. And then the data engineers comes and say, well, now we're just waiting to get all the data sourced. And then you identify that the biggest problem is actually people. And then in some organizations, they have a technology space and people, but they don't have any clear processes. If you do this on every single capability, you're able to break down and understand where you're getting stuck. And that is the key differentiating factor of being able to scale up. People say it's a resource problem. We can't hire data scientists. We can't hire data engineers. But most of the time, it's rather having bad processes on how to scale up, creating reusable patterns on how to actually go to production. And now there's some people in the room saying, I hate processes because I'm a full stack data scientist and I can do all of this myself. But that doesn't matter, because when you're scaling up within AI and data, you need to move away from people dependencies to process dependencies. Those are a little bit slower sometimes, but they create reusable value, integration path into large organizations, different systems. I hope there are nobody here from small startups, because this is not true until you hit a larger size. But I mainly work with large enterprises, and this is the key problem that they have. They don't know what capabilities they're offering. They go to the enterprise architects and they say, yes, we have a box here for information management, but we do AI and data. Yeah, but you fit in the information management box. So we need to take it down one level below, start identifying what we really need on doing these topics. And then ask the business side, how would you like to use our services? Are these capabilities correct? I can tell you, the most used of these are actually data publishing. So it doesn't matter for us to talk about the coolest models to the business side, run one-time POCs in organizations when all of the other things are actually red. And this gives us clear input in what activities we need to perform. Maturing a field means creating best practices, creating clear ways of actually reproducible value, and it also requires us to higher our thinking, or elevate our thinking is a better word. Because if we only think about the details, we will never be able to have the discussion with the organization and tell them what they need to do for us to be successful. This is the maturation that has happened in software engineering. These are the best practices that has been established within software engineering. We need to start adopting to more reusable patterns. We need to start talking about what capabilities are we providing as data scientists, machine learning engineers, the systems that we are building are producing what? Because otherwise we will never, ever be able to create a clear plan on how to make AI at the core of large organizations. I always say I want to change the world. I truly believe that using AI and data is the best way of doing that. And if we're ever going to be successful, we need to target the large enterprises, because they are holding the world by a big grip. And the only way to get them to actually start being AI-driven and utilizing data for real is to adopting also to their language. This they can understand. And if we can then produce a clear path towards them, saying that, hey, we have within the technology space this under control. We can commit that we are going to deliver this platform that has these capabilities. We can deliver all of the topics in between. That we can do by ourselves today, because there are so many talented people in this room. And I know many of you have been a part of building ML systems, have put models into production. We know how to do that. But on the other side, we are not that good with processes, at least not the companies I visited. It is starting to be mature, but we need some sort of governance processes, especially now that it's becoming more and more lawful as well. There are new requirements coming. We need to adopt to them. We have GDPR already in place. We need to be better at that. And then the conversation we need to have is that when we have central teams actually producing all of these topics, we need to start talking about decentralized capabilities as well. Because if you are a small team in an organization, you will always have a large backlog, even if you create this. We need to start looking at how can we get the business side then to get on board, hire their own data engineers, making sure that they have data scientists. If you look on the paper that Meta published, I think it's a few months back now, where they described their journey. They started with decentralized, distributed teams. They could move very fast, but they didn't produce much value. Of course, some here and there in the early stages, but there were a lot of deduplication of value. There was a lot of focus on their own models and not sharing any of the value, no clear processes and ways of working. So they centralized everything into one team. And by doing that, they also had a clear focus on maturing. They created best practices, ways of working, they created different libraries, technology stacks. And then they started scaling up. So they did all of those capabilities assessment. And then the step after that was decentralization. Then they could create these teams because they had a joint path on how they should work together. And this is why I think, in order for us to become truly professional within this field, we need to start maturing. And the stage where we are at right now is that we know the models, we know the technology, we don't know the processes well enough yet, and we haven't reached a stage we are able to do decentralization out into a larger organization. And these are the main bottlenecks. I guarantee you. Now somebody might challenge me and say, but I can build the models in 2 weeks and use a system and put it into production. Good. But doing 1,000, 2,000, having all decisions driven by AI and data? I doubt it. So, that was the end of this presentation. Tomorrow I will try to tie it also towards technology and AI platforms, how it can be adopted there. Thank you.